Hey. If you're watching this, you're probably awake too. Welcome to Things I Can't Explain. I don't know who's here, and honestly, that's the point. I've collected a few things that happen to people just like us, events that slipped past the line where logic ends and the unknown begins. Some call it fear, others call it a glitch in the night. I just call it what it is, unexplainable. There's no easy answer tonight, just a quiet reminder that we aren't as alone as we think. So, if you have the lights on, and you're ready to listen, let's get into the first one. This happened to me about 3 years ago, in the small split-level house I grew up in. I was 22, living alone with my dog, Max, while my parents were visiting my grandmother in Ohio for a weekend. The rain was hammering against the single-pane windows of the kitchen, a sound that usually lulled me to sleep, but that night, it felt like it was trying to get in. I remember the clock on the microwave blinking 3:14 a.m. when the first sound broke the silence. It wasn't a crash or a scream, just a slow, deliberate drag of something heavy across the floorboards in the hallway outside the kitchen. I live in a place where the floors creak, but this wasn't the house settling. It was too rhythmic. I told myself it was just the old plumbing expanding in the cold, or maybe the wind catching a loose shutter. I got up and poured a glass of water, trying to shake the sudden knot in my stomach. I remember checking the back door 3 times, even though I was certain I'd locked it before bed. There was a faint scratch near the deadbolt, a sound so soft I thought I was imagining it, like someone fingernailing the wood to test the lock. I convinced myself it was just the house settling, or maybe a raccoon that had snuck in through a gap under the deck. I went back to bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, listening to the rain continue its relentless drumming against the glass, thinking the darkness was just a barrier between me and the outside world. By 4 a.m., the scratching had moved. It started in the hallway, then stopped, and then resumed right outside my bedroom door. It wasn't random anymore, it sounded like someone was pacing, waiting for me to make a move. I lay there, frozen, staring at the ceiling fan that had stopped spinning hours ago. I tried to call out, to yell for my parents who were far away, but my voice caught in my throat. I sat up and heard a soft exhale on the other side of the door, right against the wood, as if whoever was there was holding their breath, waiting for me to open it. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but the screen was black, the battery seemingly drained in seconds. I sat there listening to the breathing, distinct and wet, growing closer to the doorknob. The handle began to turn, slowly, agonizingly, as if the person on the other side was testing the mechanism, knowing it would eventually give way. The door finally clicked open, but no one was there. The hallway was empty, the moonlight cutting through the dust motes. I stood up, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might crack my ribs, and walked into the hall. I called Max's name, and he whined from the living room, terrified. I saw something then, a shadow in the corner of my vision, distinct and heavy. I spun around, and there, standing in the kitchen doorway, was a figure. They weren't a ghost or a monster, they were just a man, wearing a dark coat that looked soaked from the rain, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. He wasn't attacking. He was just watching me, his eyes reflecting the street lamp light with a terrifying clarity. He raised a hand, not to strike, but to point at the kitchen table, then turned and walked away, disappearing down the stairs into the basement, the door closing silently behind him. I never found out who he was, or why he was there. The police came the next morning, found no signs of forced entry, and no footprints in the mud outside. They suggested I might have sleepwalked or hallucinated from stress. But the evidence didn't add up. Max wouldn't let anyone touch the back door, and there was a single, wet footprint in the kitchen, right in the center of the floor, that vanished when I tried to photograph it. I still live in that house, but I sleep with the lights on, and I never, ever lock the deadbolt again, because I know now that the key doesn't make it secure. It just makes me wonder what else might be able to get in. I don't expect you to believe me, but I've tried writing it down a dozen times just to see if the words change, and they don't. This happened to me last October during a solo road trip through the backroads of Oregon. I was driving to catch a flight out of Portland, and the GPS decided to reroute me through a stretch of forest that wasn't on any map. I ended up at a small, wooden cabin that looked like it had been abandoned for 30 years, but the lights were on. I went in, sat by the cold fireplace, and just waited for the fog to lift so I could find the road again. The place smelled like wet wood and something sweeter, like old honey. It was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air is holding its breath. I sat in a worn velvet armchair that creaked under my weight, watching the shadows stretch across the floorboards. There was a framed photo on the mantel of a family I'd never seen, but the faces looked too sharp, like they were staring right at me from the picture frame. I told myself it was just fatigue, the stress of a long drive making my eyes play tricks. I made coffee in a chipped mug and watched the steam rise, thinking about how the temperature kept dropping despite the fireplace. I kept checking my phone, but the signal bars were flickering between full and empty, as if the house itself was playing with the connection. The first real sign something was wrong came around midnight. I heard the floorboards creak in the hallway, but it sounded like footsteps were dragging, heavy and wet. I walked out to investigate, but the hallway was empty, the darkness thick and absolute. I told myself it was the wind settling the old wood, but then the phone rang. It was a landline in the corner, a rotary phone I hadn't noticed before, and the ringtone was a tinny, distorted version of a song I used to hear as a kid. I picked it up, but the line was dead, just a hollow silence. The temperature plummeted so fast I could see my breath clouding the air. I tried to leave, but the front door wouldn't budge, the handle cold and locked from the outside, even though I was the only one inside. I went back to the living room, locking the interior door, and sat back down, trying to rationalize a break-in or a prank. But the shadows in the corners of the room started moving, detaching themselves from the walls, lengthening toward the center of the room. Then, the lights went out. Not just the ones on the ceiling, but every source of light in the cabin, plunging me into a darkness so dense it felt like water pressing against my skin. I heard the scraping sound again, louder this time, coming from right behind the velvet chair I was sitting in. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, and saw a figure standing there. It wasn't a ghost, it looked like a man, but his face was a smooth, pale surface where features should be, except for two deep, dark holes where his eyes should be. He didn't move, just stood there, tilting his head at a grotesque angle that cracked like breaking twigs. I screamed, but no sound came out, and then I felt his hand on my shoulder, heavy and cold, and a voice whispered directly into my ear, not in words but in a sensation of pure, cold dread, telling me I was already part of the house. I woke up the next morning on the side of the road, miles away from where I'd parked. The engine was off, the keys still in the ignition, and my car was intact. I drove straight to the nearest motel, packed my bags, and took the first flight I could find. I never went back to that cabin. I still drive past the area where I think it was, but I can never find the road that leads there again. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound of a rotary phone ringing in my own apartment, and when I check, the phone is unplugged, sitting silent in the corner, waiting for someone to pick up. This happened to me 3 years ago, during a solo camping trip in the deep woods of Oregon. It was late October, the kind of crisp, damp evening where the air smells like rotting leaves and pine needles. I had set up my tent just off a narrow, unmapped fire road, far from any cell service or other campers. The silence out there is heavy, the kind that presses against your ears. I remember thinking it was the perfect escape until the first night, when the darkness felt less like an absence of light and more like something watching. I had chosen this spot specifically for its isolation. The previous day, I hiked in about 2 miles from the main trail, carrying a heavy pack with my sleeping bag and a small propane stove. The trees were dense, a wall of ancient Douglas firs that seemed to swallow the sunlight hours before sunset. When I set up camp, I made sure to pitch my tent facing a small clearing where I could see the moonlight filter through. It felt peaceful. Or at least, it felt like the kind of peace a city person dreams of. But as I sat by the small fire, roasting a marshmallow, I noticed something odd about the firewood I'd gathered. There was one log that was already charred on one side, perfectly blackened, though I had never struck a match against it. I told myself I must have dropped a burning ember from a previous day's fire, or maybe the dry wood had spontaneously combusted from the friction of the wind. It was a small thing, easily dismissed, and I tossed the log into the flames, watching the smoke curl upward into the indifferent sky. By midnight, the temperature had dropped sharply. The fire was just embers now, and the forest sounds had stopped. No owls, no rustling squirrels, just an absolute, suffocating quiet. I decided to get up and check the perimeter, to make sure I hadn't left any food out that would attract a bear. As I stepped out of the tent, the moonlight revealed that the tree line had shifted. The gap in the trees I'd used as a landmark was now blocked by a dense cluster of saplings that definitely hadn't been there earlier. I laughed at myself, blaming the fatigue and the altitude, telling myself I was just seeing things. I went back inside, zipped the tent, and tried to read. But then I heard a sound from the other side of the tent fabric, a wet, dragging sound, like a heavy wet sack being pulled over dirt. It stopped right by my head. I froze, holding my breath, convinced it was a raccoon or a deer. Then, the sound moved again, slowly circling the tent, and I heard a voice, or what sounded like a voice, whispering my name from the other side of the canvas. It wasn't the wind. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it out, but the beam only cut through a thick, unnatural fog that seemed to be forming instantly around the tent, hiding the trees just feet away. The panic finally broke through when I saw the shadow. It wasn't a shadow cast by an object, it was a silhouette that detached itself from the trees and walked right up to the tent wall, pressing against the fabric. I could feel the pressure of a hand, large and cold, pushing from the outside. The mesh of the tent door bulged inward, stretching until the threads groaned in protest. I scrambled for my knife, my heart hammering against my ribs, screaming for it to stop, to go away. The pressure increased, and I saw two distinct fingers press against the fabric right where my face was, outlining a shape that looked like a human hand but with too many joints. The air inside the tent turned freezing, breath fogging instantly. The shadow didn't just press, it seemed to be trying to push the entire structure inside out. The sound changed from a whisper to a low, guttural grinding, like stone on stone, vibrating through the soles of my boots. I backed into the far corner of the tent, clutching the flashlight like a weapon, waiting for the tear, for the fabric to give way and whatever was outside to spill in. It didn't rip. The shadow just stopped, and the pressure vanished as quickly as it had come. The fog cleared, the trees were back in their original positions, and the fire was just a pile of ash again. I sat there for hours, shaking, waiting for the morning. When the sun finally rose, I packed up in a rush, driving my tent pegs in so hard they bent. I didn't look back. I drove straight out of the woods, refusing to stop at any gas stations or convenience stores, just heading home. When I got to my apartment, I unpacked everything, but the tent was gone. The bag was still there, full of the same sleeping bag and clothes I had packed. I had never taken the tent out of the car. I had never even unzipped the bag after the drive. But the bag was empty. The only thing left inside was a single, wet, mud-caked sapling, exactly the kind that had blocked my view of the clearing. If you've ever had an experience that slipped just past your understanding, I want to hear it. Drop your story in the comments below. You never know who else might have been sitting in the dark with similar memories. For now, I'll leave you with a warning. The next video covers events that are even harder to make sense of, so you might want to keep the lights on. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss them. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you in the next one.